It's going. All right, here we go. So big topic. We're going to cover a number of things. And I want to make sure that something is really clear because this is the biggest misconception and I feel like it's a really nice place to start. As we talk about these forces, they occur in a really predictable fashion over time. And again, it's probably the biggest underpinning of everything about biology that we've understood. It's an extraordinarily big idea. But evolution is not this process with a lot of thinking by organisms or individuals. And that makes sense because many organisms don't have a thinking brain. But evolution is a tinkerer, not an engineer. Let's do it. A lot of learning targets for today. Oh, wow, cool. A lot of learning targets for today. And really, we're going to focus again on what's key for environmental science, which is how do we end up with this thing about genetic diversity, which is really important. But we're going to talk about how species are created over time. So there's a really close link between genetic diversity that drives species diversity, which drives ecosystem diversity, biome diversity, everything on planet Earth. So these processes, we've kind of been going in a reverse manner. Our textbook thought it's a better way to do it from the genetic side, but I thought it's easier to take the thing that's easy to understand with our brain and work backwards. So we're doing it in the reverse model. We're going to talk about new species being formed and the pace and the drivers that actually cause that. And we'll really be focusing on just talking about selective pressure in the environment because that's the environmental thing of evolution and not the biological genetic thing. But we're going to look at how the environmental change can cause extinction over time and how it causes new species and diversity over time. This cladogram right here on the right, I put up because it was something that I knew people would be familiar with because I remember teaching it in my Science 10 class last year about the fossil record. And what's important to understand is two things from this. All species are related, and we can look at some of these species maps and gigantic cladograms exist to show where the spectrum of all species. And we have shared common ancestors. So if I look at this whale, and I look at its genetic diversity and the fossil record, and I can figure out that it's closely related to this, but if I want to find the first common ancestor between this and this, I have to go all the way back to here. So when you see these cladograms, and it's very common exercise to say, well, what's this first shared common ancestor between these two? And you're always working backwards. That's the number one thing, and we chart these all, but this is a finished product. So we're going to talk about how this is created by the environment, and this is what the finished product looks like. But the thing that's also interesting to know is the scale and the scope of time. So we are able to realize and observe this in real time, but it's only with a few species. So we feel really good because of the other weights of evidence, but the scope of time for observation is huge. Millions of years typically, at least tens of thousands of years to typically millions of years for new species being created. Here we go. So the example from the textbook, and I don't know why they use this example, but I'm going to use it just for standardization and continuity. This is from 10,000 feet what we're talking about. So we've got two amphipods, some parents. They get together. They do the amphipod, womfadoodle, you know what I'm talking about? It's romantic. They get together, they have a glass of wine, they go back to their little space in the creek, and some babies are born. And then the babies look like this. So the parent generation, and then we have the progeny generation. And because there's diversity and variety of traits in a population, the progeny will look like the parents, they'll resemble the parents, but there'll be some variation. And in this case, it's telling you in this environment, there's this fish over here, which I think is a walleye, I don't know, but it has more likely to see the ones that are larger. No thinking involved. So the amphipods didn't say, you know what would be really nice? I noticed that if we're small, we're more likely to survive, so let's just try to be small. That's not how it works. It's not an engineer. It's a tinkerer. So the progeny generation the second time includes different genetics because the large ones are more likely to be eaten. So the selective pressure in this case is a predator, and the small one survives. Its genetics are more likely to be passed on. So the next time we get a population that looks like this, the big ones again are eliminated, and over time, in this case it shows like 4 generations. It takes a lot longer than that, many more generations, because this just started with 2 parents. When we're looking at a whole population, we have to take into account some other time factors and movement, which we'll look at. But you end up with all small ones. See the change that happened over time from 10,000 feet? This eventually resulted in this. If these get different enough, we have a new species. So here's some of the key hits. So any population includes natural variation. So these are all the traits that exist over time. I'm going to use this box of rocks that you'll recognize. Some basalt, some granite, but we're going to say all these rocks are the same species. I'm just going to use this for demonstration purposes to talk about this. So if you look at these, and I hold this up, we have 2 rocks, and these both kind of look the same, right? But if you look at this, you can definitely tell those are different rocks, right? They're not exactly the same. The dimensions are different. It's really easy for certain traits, like this color trait in this case. It's really easy to see black, but there are all kinds of other traits that exist, and we call that the gene pool. So all of the genes that cause all of the phenotypes that represents all the diversity of the individuals in the population, that's natural variation of traits. We call that the gene pool. So because of limited resources in the environment and selective pressure, what ends up happening is some of those traits will favor survivability, more offspring that can survive, and to a rate where they can actually reproduce, and that's the key. So it's not just that they survived at one time, they have to reproduce so that the genes get passed on, and the ones that make it to maturity and reproduce, they're more likely to produce offspring that have those same traits, and the genetic variation starts to shift over time, and the future generations cause new species. So the main thing to take away from this slide is selective pressure is anything in the environment that's going to influence the ability for genes to be passed on. So it's a selective pressure. Another way of thinking about that is it's a threat to survivability. It's a threat. And the ones that have certain adaptations, which I want to make sure that this piece is clear. These are adaptations that lend themselves to genes being passed on. It's not like if it's cold, well, I can just acclimate to the cold and become more hardy. That's adaptation for an individual, but that doesn't have anything to do with genes. The adaptations we're talking about here have to do with genes, and any adaptations that improve survivability or fitness, those are the ones that are going to get passed on. Feel good? We're going to look at this in a lot more detail here in a second. From 10,000 feet, that's the story. So it's important to respect a few things. So I made a lot of assumptions on the previous slide. That there's variation in the population, and some of those things cause survivability to shift over time. So I want to make sure that I acknowledge the forces that are actually causing the variation within the gene pool. So if I call that whole box of rocks there, all the phenotypes that are driven by all the genotypes, those collective genotypes for all of these is the gene pool. It's constantly changing over time because of a few different things. Number one is mutations. So you can have a mutation that occurs, and it may change survivability, it may function as an adaptation. Most mutations are not good. So mutations, we think about those as mistakes that occur, and they happen in a fairly predictable pattern, like 5,000 every time replication happens. 1 in 5,000 might make a change. Some of them don't do anything. Some of them produce something that doesn't affect adaptability. Some of them produce mutations that are in what's called the somatic mutation, which means that's just for this individual. It's not going to matter. But if it gets into the germ line, so the genetics that actually get passed on, those could could actually be advanced through sexual reproduction, and those mutations might have some hand at play, but you can see it's fairly complicated. First, a mutation has to occur, then it has to be a germline mutation, and it has to improve adaptability. We definitely see many examples of this in the fossil record and then the genetic record over time, but this isn't the main way. This is not where most variability in the gene pool comes from. It comes from this way. So when the gametes are being formed, you get an independent assortment of chromosomes coming together, and so there's variation just by that. If you have pairs of chromosomes and they randomly assemble into all kind of complex ways, that's variation. When you have the mother and the father's genetics coming together and then independent assortment there, that's also variability, which is what accounts for all the variability. We're all the same species. You see a lot of variability in this room. Those changes are due to those things. And then we have this other really crazy thing that happens, chromatid crossover, and we get recombination, which causes even more variation. So these processes that are typically, what is this, mitosis or meiosis? Do we remember? Meiosis. So in this process of meiosis here, this is where most of the variation comes from. So we're getting shifts happening in the gene pool primarily because of this recombination, independent assortment, and segregation. Does that make sense? So I don't know why, that's another misconception, but when talking about evolution, people are always like, mutations. Sure, but not really. Okay? Questions on this slide? Beautiful. Let's keep going. This is going to be a big concept here to understand. So the gene pool, we've been talking about a lot. I'm going to stick with this simulation for a second before I give you more text. So let's just play here for a second. So we've got all of these individuals. If I'm going to grab a population just by random. So I've got, in this population, I get 1, 2, 3, 4 black and 3 green. Those are only some of the traits. There's also the angularity, how flat versus how bulbous or round. We could look at all kinds of traits, right? And those collective genes that cause all the phenotypes, that's the whole gene pool. But for our purposes, let's just pay attention to the green color, right? So here's our population. It's almost even. But if the black trait is dominant, when these three get together and produce offspring, and they're going to produce, each pairing is going to produce 2, the green is going to be overtaken by black, and even in one generation here, my second generation, we end up with, what do you think, more diversity or less diversity? Less diversity. This is something that's really easy to get our minds around, and it's a big theme, especially for environmental science. When the population is small, inherently the gene pool is, in a corollary way, also small, and so therefore, the genetics over time are becoming less diverse. Okay? So we have terminology that we're going to use to create this. And just keep in mind, I didn't create the terminology. And there's some confusing terms here because they all start with the same prefix word, which is gene or genetic. And then there's a secondary word. And the secondary word is going to be the important thing. But because new genotypes are being created over time, mutations and recombination, those are driving, what we see is we have some movement of genes, which is called gene flow. And so let me take this example again, and we're going to have some population. And let's say, let me just pull out a couple rocks here. Let's say we have a bunch of green rocks over here, and then I've got some genetics. This is the same species, but he's over here, and he comes over, he's looking for a mate. And say these are all female and this is a male, and so he comes into the population and he brings a new trait. He's bringing his gene from somewhere else to another place, just like a river would flow from somewhere to somewhere, right? So that's the way I remember it. Gene flow. We bring in some new genetics, and it's been introduced, and even though there's been populations and mutations and recombination happening over time, here's a new trait. So then when this one comes and these two mate together and they produce 2 offspring, now we have this. And over time, the population genetics or the gene pool is going to change. So gene flow causes this thing called gene drift. So now the genetics are going to drift. If we are going to plot the population, it would start to shift over time, shift or drift, to start looking a little bit different. So now, if I mate these two pairings and they produce offspring, right, the population, the probability is starting to change over time. Does it make sense? I call that, or we call that in science, genetic drift. So it's a change over time, just assuming normal probability and random assortment. And what we see, oops, I don't know how that got in there. Let me pull that back out. So we call that genetic drift. This is a normal process, and it can happen in a statistically predictable way. But one thing really matters, one assumption matters a lot, and it's the size of the population. So when the population size is small, gene drift typically results in less genetic diversity in the gene pool. When the population is large, shifts and random assortment and recombination and gene flow is happening in a way that typically maintains diversity or sometimes promotes diversity. So the population size matters a lot. Greg loves that, or he loves whatever he's looking at. He's happy.
Yeah, I heard gene drift, so it made me think of this. You've ever seen the movie Tokyo Drift?
No. Sorry, not a reference I can relate to. But we got it. Gene flow, gene drift. Genetic diversity is either maintained or constricted, and it usually has to do with the size of the population. Population size matters a lot. It matters a lot. That's something I'm going to carry forward to the next slide. Okay? So now, something that we've been talking about a lot. We've got all kinds of selective pressure we got to talk about. We want to acknowledge every single one of them. So first of all, let's talk about a major disturbance. So I'm going to bring in the text. This looks the same. So we've got recombination, gene flow, and gene drift. But now I have this new term to layer on here, and it's called the bottleneck effect. So here's my population. We've got a whole gene pool. And then whammo! Volcano. And only 5 survive. Okay? So a bottleneck effect. What did I just do? What's the main thing that you just observed? It's the most obvious thing. It's not a trick question.
Population size dropped.
The population size dropped. So here's my genetic diversity. We're in the bucket there. And then I'm going to bottleneck. Who's going to survive? It's totally random. But because I've reduced the genetic pool by virtue of reducing the genetic size, well, what do you think is going to happen genetic drift-wise about the diversity?
There's more diversity.
Is there? I had
No,
a lot.
it'll decrease diversity.
Decrease diversity because I reduced the population size. Population size matters a lot.
For genetic size. So why was it that earlier the small population was more diverse?
It started off more diverse.
It started out diverse and became less diverse over time because
okay.
it got constrained. Okay? So when we have a major disturbance event, which happens all the time, volcanoes, road being built, all kinds of stuff is happening all the time on our planet, now and forever. And that process causes changes in the gene pool for population, right? So that's one thing. We call that a bottleneck event because you're bottlenecking the gene flow and the gene drift, right? That's one thing. We have another thing that I want to talk about. The first 3 bullets are all the same, and then there's this new terminology that's called founder effect. But what you'll notice is there's some key changes. So I've got a population over here, but competition is getting fairly fierce because as our population gets bigger, it's harder to survive. There's limited resources. So myself and a couple of my buddies, we go, we're out of here, man. There's not enough. We're going to go find a new place to live. So we go over here, and now these are the founders of a new area. What do you notice that's true? Population size is what?
Tiny.
It's small. And what do you think is going to happen with the genetics in this gene pool? It's going to drift to be more diverse or less diverse?
Less diverse.
Less diverse. Well, meanwhile, this one is going to either be preserved diversity or potentially increase in diversity over time.
Why would that one increase?
Yeah, why?
Because of population size. It's just still big.
Okay.
Right?
So larger populations will end up gaining more diversity while smaller ones lose diversity?
Because of
Definitely.
mutations.
Otherwise known as the point I made while you were looking up your video.
I was
Just
listening.
kidding. Just messing. Got it? Feel good? All right. So here we go.
Just double check.
Here's the term that it refers to how this evolution occurs and produces diversity. Again, in the scale of time, it's really big. So speciation is the formation of newer distinct species. So these processes that we've just talked about that are the normal ways, the normal drivers, selective pressure in the environment, that's going to cause new species to be created. The easiest one to understand is geographic isolation, or some type of change that's going to cause the species. So if I pour out my gene pool and I've got my population like this, and it could be anything, a flood, a road, a volcano, whatever, disruption in the environment, it separates the two. And especially if one ends up being a slightly different environment. So now the selective pressure over here, maybe all the competitors are over here, or all the predators, or more predators, or a disease event, or a different type of environment that's slightly different. It's going to cause the genetics of population A to shift, and it's going to cause the similar forces that are different in nature, but similar forces, they're going to cause population B to change and shift over time. A new species is created. Whenever there's some geographic isolation, that's called sympatric speciation. I don't have a good way to remember that. It's just geographic is key.
Wait,
The geography.
Sympatric or allopatric?
Oh, sorry. Woo, good catch. Allopatric. Sorry. Allopatric. Geographic isolation, allopatric.
Patrick, how far it
How does that help with
I don't know.
geography?
They do both have the geo and allo. I've heard people use that before, like geo and allo go together. The other way is really awesome and very complex, so we're just going to try to brush over it. But there are all kinds of species that have more genetic diversity inherent in their genome, typically plants. Plants rock. The human genome has 3,000 genes. That oak tree out there, 120,000. The design time for evolution, way longer for the tree. Tree's natural history spans 3.5 million years, way shorter for humans, or for most animals. And as a product of that, lots of plants, the example they give in the textbook is wheat. And wheat has 6 copies of its genome. We call that polyploidy. So it has all these other versions, and each new progeny gets 6 copies, and so the recombination events are way higher and the variation is higher. So you see shifting in species, and it's in absence of any geographic, there's no disruption, there's no geographic thing that's causing isolation of population. You just get new species being created just because of polyploidy. So polyploidy and sympatric go together, geography and allopatric go together. Does that make sense?
How do you spell polyploidy?
Just like this, P-O-L-Y. I gotta write it. There you go.
Thank you.
P-O-L-Y, P-L-O-I-D.
Cal, I figured out how allopatric makes you think of it. Because
Uh-oh.
Patrick went to the equator where it's warmer and there's more sun, therefore he needs aloe, and that's also the geography piece.
Aloe vera.
I'll probably remember
Plant.
that. Yeah. I
The
mean,
question is, do aloe vera plants have polyploidy? That's a question for Google. All right. Feel good about this? Allopatric versus sympatric. When does class get over, by the way?
30.
30. Phew. We've got to hustle. We can do it. Oh, no, we're good. We don't have to worry. Feel good about this?
Yeah.
I feel really good. Great. So, now we need to kind of talk about the selective pressure that exists in the environment and how populations shift to meet demands of the environmental pressure over time, which is kind of the major theme. So it's really easy to look at evolution and say, yeah, sure, if there's a predator and this is a prey, certain ones that are smaller have a higher survivability. But that pressure in the environment is not the main driver for evolution. It's usually the environment itself. And so we're going to learn about this thing called range of tolerance, which will not be the first time you hear about this, and it's a huge pillar for our class. So we're going to do a lab on this. I'm going to put together a little thing for us so that we can visualize what it looks like. But we know every species on Earth has some range of environmental condition X that it can tolerate. So let's look at this graphic in the far right here. Performance is on the y-axis, but there's some synonyms that you'll see a lot. So it could be population. This is the bad marker. Where's the good marker? Population, or it could be fitness, or it could just be number of individuals, all kinds of things. Number of individuals or population is the easiest one for me. Fitness, sure, but when you see this kind of thing, think about, we're trying to figure out how many individuals. On the x-axis, we can pencil in any environmental condition. This one gave me temperature. Give me a couple other examples. Let's make a list.
Limiting resource.
Give me an example of one. I agree with you.
Water.
Water availability. Sure. Give me some more.
Amount of predators.
Predators. Yeah. What else?
I just have a question about for like predators.
Yeah.
Would that almost look like the opposite shape? Because if there's more predators, they're less likely to survive.
It depends. So we will make some distinction about predators because that's going to be more of a differential pressure than a selective pressure, but I'll put it on the list for now. What else?
Precipitation.
Sure. What else? Let's see if we can get 4 or more.
Oh,
Yeah.
wait, no, I already said temperature, never mind.
It's all right. What else?
Winds.
Sure. Believe it or not,
Sunlight.
available sun.
Sunlight.
Insulation.
Yeah, what else? 2 more. How about just something like calcium or amount of salt or salinity or other nutrients, magnesium, or it could be I don't know, all kinds of stuff. Anything in the environment, anything that we could measure. Feel good about this? So a lot of these show up on a limiting nutrient list. So temperature is the example they give here, where I really like using sun or precipitation or other really common ones because they are ones driving population a lot. And the breakdown goes like this. There's some optimal range that every species likes, and it doesn't like it through thought, it likes it through tinkering. Over time, the evolutionary processes have driven the population to favor this environment. Does that make sense? So for temperature is a great one. Like if we say, we put this on here, well, humans, we really like it at about 70 degrees. Some other organisms like it at cooler temperatures. Some other organisms like it a lot warmer. The surface of Mercury is like somewhere way over here. It's so hot that nobody can survive. So on planet Earth, the fact that we've spent a lot of time setting up and saying, look at this place. It's got the suitable conditions for life, but not all life specifically that's been evolved to exist in that area over time. So we have a couple things to layer on here. When the conditions are the best, organisms aren't just alive, they're flourishing, they're thriving, they're extremely happy. We call that the realized niche, where most of the population can be found. So if we go out to Gorongosa and we're looking at, well, these plant species, well, some places next to the water may be too marshy and they're not there. It's too much water. In other places it's too dry, but in the place where they're really, you find a lot of them. It's the perfect spot. Survive, reproduce, and grow. that is called the realized niche. That's where most of them are found. Anytime you move, so if we say it's getting hotter, they're surviving and they can maybe grow, but they're under a little bit of stress. Eventually you get to where they are just barely hanging on. They're surviving, but it's not good. And way over here, they're dead. And the opposite is true. These are always kind of mirror images, these distributions. So as you move away from the optimal, this way it gets colder. They can survive and grow, then they can just survive. Then over here, they're dead. None can survive. And we do every organism for every environmental condition. So if you look at yourself or a frog or a bird, we can do a distribution to see what these look like for salinity, what these can tolerate, the range that they can tolerate for sun, for precipitation, for wind, for whatever. All of the traits are all of the environmental factors. So that's where this term comes from, the range of environmental conditions that a species can tolerate. This whole thing we call the fundamental niche. So this is where they can survive. So the range of tolerance and the fundamental niche are kind of similar. And what you'll notice is both of these have the word niche. So this is the place, the role that a species has in the ecosystem. More niches, more resources, more fundamental niches, all of those things. So there's a reason that we carry forward this ecological term of niche and apply it to this. So what you notice is every species has a set of optimal ones, but generalists have a much wider fundamental niche. They can tolerate more. So something like a raccoon, it's happy when the temperature is below 0. They're also fine if the temperature is over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. They don't mind. They have a wide range of tolerance. Something like coral in the coral reef, for temperature, very narrow. They're thriving at 80 degrees, at 85, they're dead. So specialists look like this. Does this make sense so far? All right, so here's how I want to relate some of these things together. So if I draw a fundamental niche for any species, and I'm just going to say environmental 1, we're going to call this species 1, and this is the population, right? If the environment changes, so this is the fundamental, or this is the realized niche from here to here, and this is the average. These ones are doing the best, but we're doing pretty well right here. And say the environment changes and it shifts this way to now where the new range looks like this. This is selective pressure because all of these are probably they're no longer flourishing or reproducing. They're either dead or just surviving, or maybe surviving and growing, but they're not reproducing. These are reproducing, so their genes are the ones that are more likely to get passed on to the future. The fact that our planet has been doing this process of toggling and changing the environmental factors over time is hugely important. That is what has created all of the diversity on our planet across all of the time that our planet has existed with life on it. So all of those drivers that we just learned, that's what's causing biodiversity. So species adapt to fill these niches. This is called adaptation right here. We'll have certain ones that have traits that are more likely to survive if there's a change. But what we know is genetic diversity will help preserve species biodiversity, which helps create biodiversity. So the environment can only support so many individuals. So the more niches, the more species, the more biodiversity. That's a product of this happening on this iteration of range of tolerance being pushed one way or the other by environmental change over and over and over. Seasonal variation, volcanic event, ice age, all kinds of stuff happening. That is what's created all the biodiversity on the planet. What I wanted to show here is a couple of things. This shows like an environmental continuum, the same kind of range of tolerance and different lines. And if the species are overlapping, there's competitive exclusion, right? But say the environment changed, this species would go extinct and this species would survive and flourish. If we have two species like this, and they're overlapping here and the environment changes like this, suddenly competition gets a lot more fierce between species 1 and species 2. So the change in the environment drives community interactions, and it's altering that, and both of those together are producing more biodiversity over time. How do we feel? Pretty good. You're all right on a 40-minute day. Let's look at one example. So I've got two examples in here. This is a pine, and they give this example in the text, and I like it. It's a good one. So here we have the abundance. The dark green means there are more, so the population size is higher, and where it's light green, it's lower. So A shows the current distribution, and in 2100, that's the predicted distribution. What do you notice if you just look at A? Why would there be a lot of pine? What do you think if we were going to put something on this continuum, what would really matter? Yeah.
Guessing temperature?
Yeah.
Could be temperature, and there's
precipitation.
some kind of latitude effect, so
Yeah.
latitude and maybe solar insolation, right? So why would this change over time?
Earth's getting warmer.
Yeah.
If the temperature changed, then probably not the amount of insulation isn't going to change, but the amount of temperature is, and so the distribution changes over time. Oops. So here's another quick example. So we show these over many thousands of years. So this is 18,000 years, 12, 6, and here is now. And then the same kind of scale, green is greater. And so here are the different species, pine, spruce, and birch. So if we look at these distributions, well, which one has a wider range of tolerance? What do you think for a polar climate?
I think pine for sure.
Pine.
And what's the evidence? I hear a lot of people saying pine.
It seems to cover the most land area out of the three species.
Covers more than one climate.
Which one do you think is more likely to be considered a generalist versus a specialist between these three?
Pine.
Pine's probably
Because it's
generalist.
existing in a lot of different
Yeah, look,
ecosystems.
it's in Florida.
Yeah.
It's really having a
migrated,
great time in
changed, and
Florida.
eventually, you know what we call this?
What?
Speciation is going to occur.
Oh.
The environmental conditions are pretty different between Florida and Alaska, but the generalists, this is going to happen a lot slower over time. Very good. Great day today, gang. We'll get these slides loaded up. I will see this group again.